what other attachment styles are there then when it comes to a relationship?
Well, there are three attachment styles. There's secure attachment, anxious attachment, and avoidant attachment. And within avoidant attachment, there are two sort of subgroups, which is dismissive avoidant and fearful avoidant. The secure attachment is when people are kind of feel secure, feel stable. There's not a lot of highs and lows. There's not a lot of conflict that's kind of negative and destructive. People are able to be close and intimate and trusting of one another relatively easily. So you've got lots of different ways of trying to feel safe and trying to sort of maintain a sense of control in a relationship.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another exciting episode. And do you know what? This one, I say this in every episode. I'm like, right, I'm so excited for this conversation. But this one's kind of like off topic. I've never really done a conversation like this. And we're going to be talking all things relationships, how to make relationships the best relationships that can possibly be, how to love your partner, understand your partner, and also help them understand you. We're talking to a keynote speaker, a psychotherapist, an author, a relationship expert, the founder of the Love Exchange community. And I bumped into her at a Guns N' Roses concert. It was such a funny incident. But she asked me a question and then we connected. And I was like, wow, this is cool. You talk about cool stuff. And I think, the funny thing is everybody thinks they know all they need to know about relationships. But in reality, they know not a lot. And in an ever-changing world, I think it's so important to kind of understand these things. So we're going to understand so many different topics. So if you're listening to this thinking, I need to understand my partner better, then this is definitely the episode for you. So I've talked for way too long now. So let me introduce this week's guest, Charisse Cooke. How are you, young lady?
I'm good, thank you. That was a great little intro. Yeah, I'm really good, and I'm very excited to speak about relationships because you're right. It is something that we assume we should know about, or maybe we even think we know about, but they can be quite confusing, let's face it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, do you know what, like, even now in this global landscape, we've got so many different things to compete with. People have never, there's never been a time where people have become so disposable, right? You can literally finish a relationship, and if you wanted to be, you could be with another person that very evening. So when times get tough, which relationships obviously always do, it's at a point where it's like, well, do you know what? You've either stick with it if you're prepared to stick with it, or you just, you're off onto the next one. And then not only that as well, you've got people that want to earn an honest living, where on the other side, you've got things like OnlyFans now, where people can just go and earn hundreds of thousands of pounds, but obviously in a way that isn't necessarily going to get you the man of your dreams, So there's so much to talk about. I said to you, this is going to be an hour, and I'll try to keep it in an hour, but if I don't, I'm really sorry. But look, I want to get an understanding, so because, I obviously know who you are. I absorb all your content. I love the stuff that you do. However, people might be not knowing who you are. So just give us a context for the people that are tuning in, listening for the first time. Who are you, and kind of what do you do?
For sure. Well, I'm Charisse, and as you said, I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm based in London at the moment. I've worked in London for over 2 decades being a therapist. And when I started out working in addiction, and I gravitated to working with families and then also people who were there for treatment on their relationships, and in particular stuff around sex addiction, sex and love addiction, which was relatively new concept back then. I was really interested in that. And from there, I just feel that as a therapist, as I've been working, everything boils down to how we are experiencing relationships. There's such a huge part of our fulfillment, our sense of purpose in life, our goals in life. It isn't cheesy to say that we all want love, because we do all want love. It's such a basic human need. So I love working with people on that. But as you say, I observe a lot of stuff that is making love and making relationships really difficult in our modern life. And that's why I decided to go online and start my Instagram and start my community, because we need guidance on what's healthy, what's not healthy, what's okay, what's not okay, because the boundaries are getting really, really blurred, and we're in a phase of real experimentation in our relationships. Relationships have never been more open, more challenging for two people who want the same things or more to come together and have a relationship. So that's what I love exploring, and that's what I love teaching and speaking on, because we need more skills as we move forward, not less.
Yeah. And what was it that spurred you to go into being a, because psychotherapist, like there must be so much that goes into actually being able to get to this point. So like
Mm.
what actually created the fascination to get into that?
Yeah, well, I'm very thankful to one of my teachers when I was 16, who sort of, in some wisdom, said you'd be well suited to be studying psychology, and I began studying psychology. But I was actually much more interested in being a writer, and I also studied English literature alongside psychology, and I often say they're the same. You know, as a writer, we observe people. We ask ourselves, why do people do that? And we create stories that are in keeping with the choices people make and the personalities that they have. And that's also the work of a therapist.
Mm.
I studied psychology, and then I segued into psychotherapy, which is a little bit different. And yes, I volunteered, and volunteered at a rehab. That's where I started working. And they also saw something in me, so they very kindly invested in me. They paid for me to get more education. They trained
Mm.
me in house, and it was the kind of thing that was unbelievably hard work. But I was just overwhelmed and excited about the fact that I could actually get paid to do this, because it's such an interesting thing, and it's an amazing way to live life and to be constantly learning. So for me, the learning aspect of it and the fascination of it just always keeps me going all these years.
Yeah, because I suppose with such a, like I say, ever changing world at the beginning, it's like there's no one size fits all anymore. It's constantly evolving and new things are arising, and
Absolutely.
but when it comes to like learning, like what, I mean, I don't even know where to start. Like, how do you learn like to be a psychotherapist? Like, do you learn about the brain, or are you learning about behavioral habits? Like, what do you actually learn when you're training?
Well, there's a lot of theory that you've got to learn. There's people that you've got to learn about, and the the sort of the paradigms and the theories to which have been clearly shown that we all exist by. And this is when I guess we sort of specialize over time. So a lot of it is almost kind of history. You're learning about therapists and psychiatrists from 50, 60 years ago, and then we're looking at that through the modern lens. And so that was something that I struggled with academically, is that it is very theoretical. So that's why I was very fortunate to be learning the theory while at the same time working in a space like a rehab, where you're just exposed to so many people and so many issues, and it's all happening in real time. And that's obviously the
Mm.
learning. That's where you really, really learn. Every person I've ever treated, every person I've ever worked with, they are teaching me a little bit, because as you just observe more people, work with more people, understand what they're dealing with. For me as a therapist, I see these patterns, I see this commonality. So I always talk about, it's very human what we do. We sort of think that it's very special and unique what we're experiencing, but actually it's part of the human condition. We all have our fears, we all have our insecurities, and there's often very good reason why we do things. It's, from the way we were raised to experiences that we've had, past relationships, they all shape what we do. So learning becomes something theoretical and practical, and that is a very great, powerful mix.
Mm. So would you say then, when it comes to, because I was actually listening to Mel Robbins today on a podcast, and she was talking to a guy about manifestation and stuff like that, and she was talking about how it's very difficult where to get rid of childhood trauma over trauma that happens when you're an adult. Because they were
Mm-hmm.
explaining kind of like the trauma that you experience as a child is kind of embedded into you as you grow. But
Yeah.
then as you're an adult, like stuff happens, but you're able to get over it because it didn't happen so early on in your life. So would you say that a lot of the traits to what's going on in people's lives now is purely down to not being able to get rid of the childhood traumas of whatever they may have experienced?
Hmm. I think it's a real sort of tenet of psychotherapy that when you meet someone, we will explore what's happening in their lives today, and then we will, in a way, track back and sort of see if this is something of a pattern or if this is something of a learned behavior or something that began in childhood that we are unconsciously recreating in our adulthood, because that is what we do. And that's right, they're called our formative years for a reason. And I often say, love is a learned behavior. What did you learn? And so when we were little, how our parents were with us, how they were with each other, what our little childhood relationships were like, even our relationships with people at school, we are learning. It's such a incredibly rich time of learning for us when we're young.
Mm.
So depending on how much attention, time we were given, how much we were heard, how much we were held, how affectionate the family was generally, all of that sets us up for what to expect and then recreate later on in our lives, because that's what's familiar, that's what we learned.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, when you first went into the addiction side of things, that must have been really interesting. But with addiction, I mean, interesting in the sense, I know it's obviously bad for those people, but interesting in the sense that you're obviously seeing stuff that's like not the everyday person goes through. But you were talking about sex addiction, right? So that was something that you was working on a lot. So your patients would be specifically sex addicts.
Yeah, we did have some people whose primary addiction was sex addiction for sure. But addiction isn't kind of often one just thing. We have
Mm.
perhaps our favorite thing that we will turn to, but when we go into treatment or when we start working on ourselves, we see that our addiction is often running in many areas of our lives. So that can be in our relationships in some kind of sex and love way, but it can be about work, it can be about food, it can be about spending. So yes, there are people for whom that was their primary issue and that was their primary addiction, but more so it was about exploring with people, actually there are addictive tendencies in these other areas, so let's also not forget about them.
Yeah, was there any ever, was there any kind of like commonalities when it came to like, was there a particular thing that would have happened to cause addiction, or is it literally just such an individual thing that then leads to addiction?
That's quite a controversial subject, so everyone will have a different opinion, and I think for me, I will respect each individual and their own experiences. Some people have addiction problems and they cite no trauma. They don't feel like any negative thing really happened to them to such a degree, and yet addiction still developed. I think there is something where genetically, if there is addiction in the family, then we do need to be careful. That propensity is there. And then certainly we can have life experiences whereby addiction will naturally develop as a way of needing to cope with
Mm.
huge difficulty, needing to escape, check out, deal with. And those are the things that addiction does seek to do in a, however, very destructive way.
Yeah, I actually interviewed a guy that I met in Dubai. He's a part of a circle that we're in, and really nice guy, but he was an alcoholic, which stemmed from, the standard kind of UK drinking culture, going to the pub on the weekends, then excelled. But he actually explained that the same thing, very similar to what you said about it being hereditary. He said the same. He's like, addiction is hereditary. His mum was an alcoholic. His dad was an alcoholic. Two different types of alcoholic. One was just go to the pub, 2-3 pints a night, but every day. The other one was locked behind closed doors, drink a bottle of whiskey, get blind drunk. And then he was one of the unfortunate ones that inherited that habit. But
Yeah.
one of the things that really stuck out is when he spoke about, the hereditary side of like, if you've got alcoholism in the family or addiction, that does genuinely does pass down, which is really, really interesting.
Absolutely. And our world and what we consume is becoming more and more addictive. So people who might have, got through it and wouldn't be exposed to anything perhaps so easily, a few decades ago, now you've got to sort of avoid getting addicted to
Yeah,
things in our world today. Things are being manufactured for that reason.
yeah. I mean, when it comes to addiction, then, because obviously having studied so many addiction kind of like situations and cases and stuff, Is there some sort of chemistry in the brain that's happening, and that's the reason why we're addicted to something? Is there something like, because you're saying obviously it can't it doesn't necessarily have to be addiction to something. It can be anything. What is it? What's actually happening in the brain then when we're addicted? Like, what's the science behind it?
Well, the reward system and dopamine, we all understand now. It's kind of, we're all sort of in our own way, we're all a little bit addicted to these mini highs that we get when we complete something at work or when we're scrolling online and we see something that's ever so slightly mood altering. So our brain is there to kind of really encourage us towards things that feel good. But if we have more of an addictive sort of neurological makeup, we are going to get so addicted to things. We're going to get addicted to that
Mm.
high, that dopamine. It's kind of that chemical addiction, whether it's through a process addiction like work or scrolling, or an actual chemical that we're putting into our bodies like heroin or alcohol or sugar. That is actually going to have the same response in our brain.
Mm.
And we're going to, if we do have a predisposition to it, or it's particularly powerful in terms of that chemical impact, we will continue to seek that out over and over again. And this is where you see studies of rats who would sooner wait, you know, with no guarantee of getting cocaine. They'd rather wait for that than actually have immediate, easy access to food. It's kind of what is right for us to survive, how our brain is kind of made up. Once these toxic chemicals are introduced to us, it's very difficult for us to say no to them. So it's very, very scary, but it is very, very real and happening in the brain.
Mm. And what like to be able to help people of addiction, then like what are the types of things that you would do as a psychotherapist focusing on addiction to kind of help them become unaddicted in a sense? I suppose, have I worded that correctly?
Well, I haven't specialized in addiction for about sort of 13 years, so things will have moved on a lot.
Mm.
And in that, there is a sort of a difference in opinion now. In my day, it was very what we would call abstinence based, was that we had to stop using, we had to detox, stop using, and then create a life without acting out in that way or using in that way, whichever way it was kind of happening.
Mm.
Nowadays, there's a lot of managing things, having limits, reducing drinking, not stopping drinking. So if someone comes to me, I've got to assess with them what they want to achieve.
Yeah.
Many people with addiction want to carry on using in some form. I guess I'm a little bit old school where I'm a bit more like, depending on what it is, the chances are you're going to have to stop using in order to stop being addictive in your life. So there are lots of different schools of thought now. But I think rehabs and certainly 12-step clinics, they are really abstinence based and they encourage people to stop using. And then we've got to rebuild some of the stuff that was perhaps maintaining the addiction: low self-esteem, inability to set boundaries, not looking after ourselves, very low self-esteem, and then also very dysfunctional relationships. All those things need to be looked at. So the need to use, to escape, to numb out becomes less. We get and develop coping skills that are a lot more effective.
Nice. So, okay, we'll stop talking about that then because it was a while ago. So, tell me about the transition. And so you're obviously you're dealing with people with addiction, and then you decide to transition into more kind of like relationship side of things. Like what happened in that journey to make
Hmm.
you kind of start to like change the focus?
Hmm. Well, I think in that first place that I worked, because I was just so open, it was such a steep learning curve. It was such an exciting time for me. And I just sort of said yes to everything. I felt like I was at an all-you-can-eat buffet of learning, and I just wanted to have as much as I possibly could. And the person who ran the
Mm.
place, an amazing guy, he worked with his wife, and his wife ran what we called, the family program, and she ran family groups. And for whatever reason, she invited me into one of the family groups, and I loved it. And that's, I think, was the beginning for me of really being interested and wanting to learn more about the relational side of things, the family dynamics of people with addiction or people with dysfunction or whatever they were dealing with. And I slowly then began working with families, and then I started working with the partners, and then I started working with the people in treatment and their partners together. And then it
Mm.
just kind of really developed from there. When I left that treatment center, I started my own treatment center, and I very much worked with people and their relationships there. And then it just soon became that was what I did. That's what I really helped people with.
Yeah, nice. And from your side of things, as a psychotherapist, like, what does love actually mean to you from your perspective?
Mm. I think love for me means a little bit of effort. It means magic plus effort equals love. So I think we can't be too rational and we can't be too practical when it comes to love. We need that magic, we need that attraction, we need that desire. But to have a really enjoyable long term relationship, it requires a lot of effort that none of us are really brought up, or very few of us are brought up to sort of fully understand what that means.
Mm.
And as we were saying earlier, in our lives today, we really do want and expect a great deal from our relationships and from our partners. So
Mm.
that's where the effort to open ourselves up to being loving, demonstrating love, that really is important.
Yeah. Do you know what? It's so funny because literally one of the questions that was coming up was, do you think we have an unrealistic expectation? As literally I was reading the questions that I've got
Yeah.
prepared for today, and that was as I was reading it, as you were
I
saying it,
love
I was
it.
like,
That's a
wow.
brilliant question.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, so I mean that's swiftly moving on to this topic then, because you know, especially I live in the UAE, right? You've got a lot of women here that expect so many different things. I remember I dated a girl
Mm.
who, bless her, she had a amazing soul. She was a nice girl, but her expectations of life was just, I mean, and don't get me wrong, it's obviously
Mm.
cultural and stuff like that, but like her expectations on a partner was just it was just crazy. It was like, you have to pay me a salary, you have to buy me a house, you have to do me this and that and the other.
Right. Yeah.
And I just thought how fascinating that somebody has this
Mm.
expectation, because I mean, let's face it, right, in the real world, some people will never buy a house in their whole entire lifetime.
Yeah.
So then to just buy a house for somebody is just like,
Yeah.
it just blows your mind of how you get to there. So it's a difficult place to be, but do you feel that this is just part of the world that has these unrealistic expectations, where there is lots of money, like the Monacos, the Miamis, the
Mm.
UAEs, the places like that? Or do you think that this is a global thing where generally we just have really, really bad expectations of each other?
Mm. Well, I just think it's becoming harder to find people who want the same things, maybe. I think that's definitely a trend that's been happening for a long time, with the world now being one big global place, as opposed to, you can understand that in the olden days, when you would just have your village and you'd have your selection of people in your village, and that's who you would marry and settle down with and live your life with, and you'll be supported by the village. We are so far from that now with our global village. To find people who have the same values, have the same expectations, have the same dreams and goals. And maybe that is even one of the biggest changes, is that we have goals for our relationships now. Again, in the olden days, you just got married for, companionship, for security, to start a family. That was kind of it. That's like the bare bones of what people want now. Some people don't want that at all. But yes, these expectations are really, really big. And I do think that there is also a move away. I've noticed this even in my own lifetime. We live in a world right now where, as individuals, we're very focused on having the best life we as an individual can have. This idea of giving 20 years to kind of just completely raising a family, or doing something for the good of the group, or just being part of that community, that isn't good enough for us anymore. We want to be building empires, we want to be having these incredibly extraordinary relationships that fulfill us and excite us and transform our lives, and they're our biggest cheerleaders, and we write Instagram posts about each other. And so there is definitely, I think, a lot of pressure on relationships now, and then it's not surprising that our relationships and other people are proving to be a little bit of a letdown, and that's causing big problems for us in our partnerships. I think it's quite negative. I specialize or work very keenly towards attachment theory. That's kind of one of the foundations of my work. And one attachment theory is anxious attachment. And I think a lot of how we relate to one another now is really exacerbating anxious attachment, because we are in a space where we are just so in touch with one another, and there's this understanding that we should be in touch so often, and if we're not in touch, then that's a cause for anxiety, or the grass is greener somewhere else, and are we actually good enough for someone else, and so that's causing us anxiety. And kind of there's this perfectionism. I think there's a relationship perfectionism that is out there that isn't good for our nervous systems. It makes us feel anxious, it makes us feel nervous, it makes us feel not good enough. And so that really exacerbates stuff that we are experiencing an explosion in anyway. I think we've never had more people on anti-anxiety medication ever in the history of the world. And I see that in the relational space too. People are anxious, and it's no surprise really.
I mean, I know this is kind of coming away from the whole topic of love and relationships and these things, but this is another thing that I've really recognized of late. And I don't know if this is an agenda that's being pushed because of the healthcare industries and how much money they make from prescribing people to these types of drugs. But everybody is just so willing to be labeled. You know, I think, well, I mean, look, we're distracted. We're constantly, as you mentioned a second ago, about all these outside signals which are buzzing at us, like your phone, a text message, an Instagram, like all these different things. I actually don't think that half of obviously there are cases of it, but I actually don't think half of the cases of what people are being diagnosed for is actually, and this is obviously a very generalized statement, but it's just the ability to focus on something. And you combine the ability to not focus on something multiplied by the fact you're seeing the life of people, especially, I mean, here it's even worse, people renting Lamborghinis and Ferraris and telling people, oh, you can make $10,000 this month, and you're sitting there thinking, I've never made $10,000. Like, my life is worthless because I can't make this much money. What am I doing wrong? And it is, but I think one of the things that really does scare me is the fact that I can't see it actually improving, because I see it's getting worse. There's a lot more diagnosis and self-diagnosis and this, and I've got ADHD, and and I've got loads of things that just, and then the first point is medication. Now, as a psychotherapist, is medication something that you're able to kind of prescribe, or you're more down the kind of holistic, natural approach of look within, let's find the solution?
Well, yeah, I mean, as a therapist, I can't and don't prescribe medication, which is something I wouldn't feel comfortable doing, because, yeah, I think it is a really difficult one, because there's some medication that is just unbelievably helpful and can be transformative for people's lives. And the people for whom that really is beneficial are often the very people who don't want to take that medication. And then you've got the rest of the population who really, we all just want that solution and something that can help us. And so I think medication can be helpful, but it also doesn't do the work of learning how to do life and learning to manage difficulty, to deal with stress, to withstand breakups, to have difficult conversations, to be professional and hold down a job. That is something that we do have to practically learn. So I think that needs to be an important distinction between which is about getting well. Getting well means there's something that's not right or kind of not okay. And so let's really look at trying to improve things and improve your ability to cope with life and enjoy life and get the most out of life. And a pill cannot do that.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, you're in a position where you meet lots of people. Whether it be, do you just do kind of like couples kind of therapy, or are you more focused down the line of individuals?
I do work with couples, but I also work with a lot of individuals. I find that a very effective way of actually working on relationships. So even if I'm working with a couple, I will work very heavily with them individually. And then I also now work with kind of groups and groups of people online, which is also fantastic.
Yeah, you know, I mean, again, another very generalized statement, but what are the kind of common things you're seeing when people come to you? What is actually going on in their life? Is there really one thing that's causing them to feel in a certain way, or is it quite a diverse amount of topics?
I think something that is part of relationships that many of us don't realize is just how powerfully the role of fear plays in relationships. Because if we are in relationships, the minute we sort of open ourselves to someone, even in a really, really small way, even if initially, we are making ourselves vulnerable. And we as humans do not like that. That is very scary, and it's very scary in our modern world. So, what I see that comes out in different ways for different people, but what is very, very prevalent is that we are all to some degree quite defensive in our relationships. And if you think about trying to get close to someone, trying to connect, trying to be intimate, trying to have these really beautiful, close relationships that we want, whilst at the same time really struggling with the vulnerability that that requires, and therefore being defensive and closed and sort of distancing ourselves, it's making intimacy and closeness very, very difficult. So, on the one hand, we really want love and connection, and on the other hand, I think we're really frightened of it and actually do things that block it.
Yeah, and do you know what? This is actually wasn't something I was planning on asking you, but you know, I mean, my girlfriend, she's really big into like star signs and stuff. Is that just a load of nonsense? Like, or are there like star signs that genuinely are quite good in terms of their compatibility in a relationship?
I mean, I guess I wouldn't know about that.
Yeah.
It's something, yeah, some clients like to talk about it, and I will talk about that and absolutely value that and respect that. But yeah, I don't know. There is something interesting, and there is a part of psychotherapy that is about that. So I think maybe there is some credence to it, but I definitely don't know about it. It is fun and interesting. I suppose that's under the fun and interesting
Yeah.
category for me a little bit more.
Yeah, and how do you feel the role of self-love plays within an actual relationship? Because, you know, when you mentioned a second ago, obviously, anxious attachments seems to be quite a popular thing in this day and age because of vulnerability and because of the fact that, you know, you're seeing all these people online and you're always constantly comparing yourself. So how crucial is self-love when it comes to a successful relationship?
It's really important because we need to have trust in our relationships, and we need to trust someone else. And a big kind of unexpected part of trust is self-trust. So when I see people come to see me after they've had a difficult time in a relationship, they will say things like, I don't recognize myself anymore. I can't believe what I did. I can't believe I stayed so long, or I can't believe what happened, or it was so painful, and who am I? It's kind of, we can really lose ourselves in relationships because in our desire to love and be loved, we will, be chameleon like and try to change and become the most lovable version of ourselves, not necessarily our authentic selves, but what we think the other person wants us to be. Or we are so defensive that we are also someone that we're not, because we're just fearful the whole time and we're guarded and we're sort of negative, we're sort of picking up on all the negative things about the relationship rather than the positive. And when that's happening, we're in a space of real fearfulness and a place where we're not trusting ourselves, and we're not trusting that we can set down the right boundaries, or we can communicate assertively, or we can even make the right choice, or we can recognize healthy or unhealthy behavior and do something about it. That comes from us and how we conduct ourselves in relationships. So when I'm working with people, I'm very, very, very focused on them behaving in ways that align with their values, their integrity, who they are as a person. That needs to be sacrosanct. We can't mess with that. That's our starting point to really be in genuine relationship with someone else.
What happens when you have a couple come to you, for example, and they say, we want you to fix our marriage. We fell in love, we were in love, we had children, we had a beautiful family, but now we hate each other. And you can see straight away that from what they're telling you, the behavioural traits just clearly shows they shouldn't be together. Do you try and help them work it out? Or is this something where, like, is the end goal for you and your practices to keep everyone together? Or do you have situations where you're like, well, actually, guys, like, in reality, should you be together?
Well, that has to be dictated by the clients. Experience has shown me that I've perhaps met clients where I have questioned, whether they would be able to go the distance and how possible, a really compatible match could be with people. And I have seen people who, against great odds and very surprisingly, have gone on to have really great partnerships where they've overcome hurdles. And then I've also worked with couples where I felt like the issues were not actually that large, were perfectly reasonable, and could very easily be worked on, and those relationships have crumbled. So it's kind of, I am there to support people in what they want, but what people generally ask when they come to therapy is, they don't say, oh, how can we fix the relationship, or how can I be a better partner? They say, how can we change this other person, because this other person is the problem in the relationship.
Really?
So it's, yes.
Wow.
Yes, of
I
course.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know whether this is because I've been exposed to so many different types of people. Well, one of the best things about being in UAE is, like, you're exposed to everybody and anybody, right? And I've just developed this thing in my life, and I did a bit of NLP training as well with an NLP coach a few years ago. And one of the things I've started to do is, before anything else, is look inside.
Amazing.
And I find it weird when I talk about this, because I mean, I manage teams of people, and to be honest, it's one of the hardest things out of everything I've ever done is actually managing other people.
Yeah.
But it's surprising how many people don't look within. And it's actually surprising that somebody would come to you and say, I need to change the other person, because they've made that first step to recognize there's a problem, but to only recognize it's that person, it's quite interesting that humans have adapted that mindset. Wow.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted to hear that you have such an introspective way of reflecting on your own behavior, because that is a profoundly sophisticated skill that many of us don't have, and it's something that requires a huge amount of self-awareness and maturity to develop. And I used to joke that if I ever wrote a book about relationships, I don't know, I think 40 years ago, there was a really famous book called The Joy of Sex that came out. And I said, if I ever wrote a book on relationships, I would write, and the title I would give it is The Joy of Blame. Because that is what we do in relationships. It's much easier for us to observe and see the behavior of someone else that's in front of us than look inwards and see our own behavior. And there's this great psychological theory, which is called fundamental attribution theory, which is we attribute a more sympathetic take on our own behaviors. So if I'm running late, it's because the traffic was bad, and the weather was terrible, and that person got in my way, and it was deeply unfortunate for me. If someone else runs late, it's because they're a disorganized person who doesn't run their life well enough, and really needs to work on their stuff. So there is this thing where we judge other people's characters, and we make a lot of justifications for our own less than ideal behavior, if we can even see it as less than ideal.
I mean, how do you, when people come and they say, this is a really interesting one actually, because they come to you and they say, right, my partner's a disaster. Like, she's doing this, he's doing this, whatever it is. How are you able to get them to look within?
Well, yeah, I mean that's very much part of the work that I have to do, and I mean a sort of a trick that I will use all the time in my sessions is as I say, well, if your partner was here, what would they say? Or how do you think your partner sees this from their perspective? And then that just can begin, and then it kind of stops people in their tracks because it's a completely different part of the brain. I'm now inviting in, empathy, curiosity is very, very different part of us, especially depending on how upset we are about it. We can be very in fight or flight almost. And so for people, and then but people will know. They'll say, oh well, they'll just say, I'm being dramatic, or I only see the negative, and I need to give them more attention or something. And I say, okay, well, let's just hold on, let's just sit with that. So your partner is communicating this stuff to you, and then we start a little bit more of an exploration of the bigger picture, the bigger dynamic. And I think that that's really, really important. And then in time, once people are a little bit accustomed to looking at and thinking a little bit more about themselves, I'll be like, that's all very well, but we cannot control other people. We can only control ourselves. So what could you have done differently that would have helped? When you look back, are you proud of that particular way of behaving? And we can begin to unpack things in that way. And then people develop the skill of thinking, okay, how can I be a bit more accountable and take a bit more responsibility?
Do you find a lot of people as well, they come to you when they're kind of 1 foot out of the relationship rather than coming before it's actually salvageable, right? So it makes your job a lot harder.
Yeah, I think there is some research on this actually, that by the time people come to some kind of relationship therapy, it's often 7 years after they've begun experiencing quite serious problems. 7 years of developing into that negative cycle of having problems. And so by the time that couples actually seek help, or anyone wanting to seek help, it is too late. And relationship therapy then becomes about ending the relationship in the best possible way. So there's something interesting there about a reticence to seeking help, a resistance to getting help, that we really need to overcome, because if people do get help earlier, then relationships can really flourish.
Yeah, because it's so. I mean, like, look, everybody can think about this in a situation. Listening to this, they'll be thinking, "Oh, there's a time where my partner did this," and like, although it's a little thing, and you know what? Like, I, again, being completely self-aware, I'm gonna acknowledge that I will allow stuff to happen and not talk about it, because maybe I'm a little bit more worried about upsetting that person if I tell them truly how I feel and these types of things. When I think in actuality that's the opposite of what you should be doing, because what you're actually doing in the long run is bottling up that feeling that you had towards that person, which deep down compounds over time, so that when that big thing, when that small thing pops up, it's like all hell breaks loose just because I wasn't honest in the beginning.
Yeah, that little bit of discomfort at the beginning can really save us huge discomfort later down the line, and things are sort of just so big and overwhelming, for sure. And I think that's something we do need to challenge ourselves with in relationships, is kind of allowing ourselves to be a little bit uncomfortable, just saying, not in extreme ways that kind of are going to reinforce some negative pattern in our lives, but in ways where we're pushing back against that, that vulnerability. We're always trying to protect ourselves from that vulnerability. We don't want to upset the other person. We don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to rock the boat, or we don't want to hurt someone's feelings. And it's kind of, we are now able to communicate in ways that are gentle and truthful. Those two things can happen at the same time. But to lean into that little bit of vulnerability, that little bit of discomfort, it's a good skill to kind of, a good muscle for us to keep trying to flex, because otherwise we lose that skill, and then the communication becomes more and more difficult.
No, that's it's very important. It's very important. But again, it's so fun, isn't it? Because I mean, I've done it. In friendships. Like, even like, for example, I had a bit of a bugbear with a good friend of mine because they weren't making too much of an effort, and I was like, no, I'm not going to tell him how I really feel. I'm just going to ignore him. And you just think to yourself, well, actually, it would be easy if you just called them up and said, hey, listen, like, I feel this, how I'm feeling. You know, what's
Yeah.
going on? Like, but we don't do that, and then it snowballs.
Yeah.
But moving on. I mean, and this topic is more. I would say this is more going to be focused on your opinion rather than your professional ability to tell me an answer to this. So try and
Okay.
answer with an open mind on these topics. Now, I really
Okay.
want to deep dive into the topic of marriage. Okay.
Mm,
Now, you're married. How long
I
have you been
am.
married for? If you don't
Crikey.
mind me asking.
10 years. 10
Wow.
years I've been married, but I've been with my husband for 18 years. So this is a quite interesting discussion then that we can
Yeah.
maybe talk
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
So I mean that's a life sentence that is in prison. No, I'm joking. No, I'm joking. But when I mean again, you're coming from a great place then because you've been with your partner for 18 years. So
Mm.
if somebody's actually listening to this, because I mean my parents broke up after 18 years. You know, unfortunately didn't go too well. But however, if you're somebody that's not even in an 18 years but 2 years, like how are you, like what are you doing? I mean, as a therapist, to be able to keep your relationship alive, like what type of traits do you implement into
Mm.
your everyday life which enables you to have a successful marriage?
Oh my goodness. I mean, my personal life, my own personal romantic relationship has informed so much of my work. And
Mm,
I think people appreciate that because they can hear that it's coming from experience of what it is like to be in a long-term relationship. You know, it is not easy and there are efforts that need to be made. I think for me, it's kind of the self-awareness that you talk about. It's like an ongoing journey because life is always changing. And when you've got kids, you've got work, you've got money, you've got, you know, you're moving home several times, you've got aging parents. There's so much that falls on a relationship. And it's really, really difficult. We're not equipped to really know what to do. So for me, kind of keeping the communication going, I have a very big personality and I can be very, shall we say, passionate about how I can express myself. My husband can experience like the 1 decibel raising of a voice as shouting, screaming. So I have had to develop a way of talking in a very composed, calm way so I can be heard. You know, there's something in our sort of narrative in our world today, which is this is who I am, and if you can't take me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best, and all of that. And I'm very of the opinion, how about we respect one another
mm,
and learn and teach each other what it is that we need? And if I claim to love this man, then I need to behave in a loving way when I speak to him, even
mm.
about stuff that's difficult. Just like I want stuff from him that is very, very difficult for him. A little bit like you, perhaps he can go silent. He doesn't like to naturally express himself. I could obviously talk for 5 days straight about my feelings. So I've had to really
Mm.
calm down and rein in my sort of natural leaning and take that to my girlfriends and take it to my friends and take it to therapy, and so then invite him to learn to feel that he can communicate more and share more of himself. You know, he was not brought up to be sharing his feelings or talking about those difficult things.
Mm.
And it's stuff that we can do today. And it's not perfect all the time. But in terms of where we both come from, it's amazing. There's a real ease there. Whereas if we hadn't put those efforts in, there would not. And that's what I see, I guess, when I'm working with people. So when I give advice, it's often from a very theoretical psychotherapeutic position, but it's also from a very
Mm.
human, this is what's going to happen if we don't really engage and we don't really love people. That's where I come back to this thing where love is an action, love is a demonstration. How are you demonstrating love in
Yeah.
your relationship right now?
And I mean, as somebody that's classed as a professional in this industry, when you're loving somebody else, I mean, I kind of know the answer to this because I've heard it before when people talk about it. Maybe it's different, I don't know, but I think I know what the answer will be to this. But when you're in a relationship, how should you love that person?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Well, that's yeah.
because I was going to say, because we always think, and I've been guilty of this many times, you always think I should love a person the way I want to be loved, right?
Mm.
But is that the right way?
Well, we will naturally do that. We will naturally do that. It's always interesting to observe what we do because we often give what we wish to receive.
Mm.
And so that's a real good little exercise for couples to notice, oh, my partner does this, or on birthdays they do that, or what they really enjoy doing together is this. That's very revealing. And so we can learn about each other. So I think that's what we have to commit to. When we commit to someone, that's what I think we should be committing to teach one another, and for us and our partners to be open to learning what love means to the other person. Because working with as many people as I have, I can assure you love is different for different people.
Yeah.
Love can be a very practical, specific act of service thing for some people, and it can be a deeply devotional, emotional, spiritual experience for someone else. And those two people need to share a life together and feel loved by one another. It's going to take a lot of learning, a lot of teaching, a lot of forgiveness, and a lot of moving forward together, a lot of willingness. And that's, I think, the best thing, is to sort of see it as a little bit of an adventure and be like, okay, well, you teach me what love means to you, and I'll teach you what love means to me, and let's do this.
So do you think stuff like the languages of love is quite important for you to understand when you are meeting a new partner?
I think the love languages is a great shorthand. It's something that people have responded to really, really powerfully, and I think it is useful because it does boil down a lot of deeply personal and quite complicated stuff in relationships to very practical, simple ways of connecting with someone. I think, love and connection are often one and the same, and it's very easy to be disconnected from people. So finding a way in, a way to connect, a way to reach someone. I think the love languages can be a very useful way of getting in there because they can be very effective.
Yeah. And I mean, I was like, I'm going to go on to this topic, and then I just completely went off topic. So let's go back to topic. So marriage, right? Obviously, we spoke
Right.
about you being married for many years and how to make it successful. But do you think, when it comes to a relationship, do you think marriage is kind of the answer to the solution? Because it's kind of like a societal thing, right? It's like, okay, you've been with your partner for a couple of years. Okay, when you get married, it's almost like it's like a dead cert that you have to do it. But again, from an opinion perspective, like, do you think it is something that is kind of the answer to a natural progression of a relationship?
I mean, I think it really depends on the people involved. But I think the positive things about marriage that I have witnessed is that when we are insecure in our lives and relationships, and many of us are, whether we realize it or not, there is something significant about the security of marriage. I think relationships with a presumed commitment do not really calm our nervous systems and allow us to be at peace and to then go into this trusted space of togetherness. It's kind of, some people might be able to achieve that, and that's great. And I think there's going to be a trend to that, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I think there is something very, very helpful about marriage for people who are in a space where they're debating, whether to be with someone, how long to be with someone, is there someone better? They're finding it difficult to really believe that long-term commitment is possible, and for them that maintains something very insecure within them. I think it's very useful, especially, I guess, in terms of planning a family, having a family. Marriage is a very useful vehicle for that, and I think it can create security in a very insecure world that we're in currently.
Yeah, because I'm reading a book at the moment called Sapiens. I don't know if you've ever read it before.
Oh yes, I've heard of that. I've not read that yet. Oh, I definitely want to read that. Yeah.
You know what? Like, when they talk about things in the book, it kind of, like, when you hear about what people do and the way people act, it makes so much more sense of why some people act in this way, just purely on the basis that, wow, 500,000 years ago, this is what humans were doing. Fast forward 500,000, this is what we're doing. And, a big part of marriage was kind of in the ancient Greek and kind of Roman era, where they obviously started to introduce religion, and that's how marriage was historically introduced into everyday life. And the reason why I find it such a fascinating topic is because I suppose it depends on what glasses you're wearing and what mouth is speaking. But if you speak to a divorce lawyer, for example, they'll tell you about the percentage rates of divorce, but then you talk about, you talk to somebody like yourself, and it's almost like a positive of like, how can we stay together? But it was really interesting because, with the book Sapiens, like they talk about, and this is kind of the question I suppose I'm coming on to is like, historically, nowadays we're told, you should marry and you should get married and find that one and be with that one, and regardless of the situation, you just got to work it, make it work. Whereas historically, prior to the marriage kind of era, male and females were in relationships with multiple partners. I mean, there's a fascinating chapter in the book of Sapiens where they talk about women when they used to get pregnant in the village. What they would do is anybody that had some sort of attribute, whether it was beautiful eyes, good looks, hunting skills, they would sleep with all of the men because in their mindset they would take all of the good sperm of each of these dominant males in the village. And then fast forward, and it's like, what are we playing with here? Are we playing with like humans' natural DNA and instinct, or is this something that is a societal norm where they're trying to like say, well, actually, no, yes, this is our DNA, but let's try and do this for the benefit of that? And I suppose the question I'm kind of get is, do you like when you're questioning your DNA and your kind of like hunter like DNA and being able to be at home and take care and raise a family compared to the marriage side, do you think we're trying to like just play with like trying to change the way we're actually meant to be, and this is why we experience so many issues with relationships, because we're technically in a world which we're not designed to be in.
100%. I mean, that was our job, was to procreate, bring the next generation, have the progeny, and then we would probably die, right? We weren't, it's kind of, there are stages to life in our modern world now that just did not exist. In relatively recent history, it hasn't existed. And to have one relationship that's going to fit every single one of those stages, I think that's where things are getting very, very complicated. And, what I observe from, if you think about compatibility, how can someone be compatible with us when we're young and learning and education and starting out in life? That's one phase. Then there's another phase of raising a family, running a home, very practical, very domestic, very different. We're doing that for a period of time. And then we're also wanting to perhaps fulfill other ambitions that we have in career or creativity or purpose. And then we get older, and then, the children are a little bit older. And again, we're wanting something for ourselves. And that might be something completely different. And then, so in some ways, what our society is kind of asking us now, and I think the younger generations are answering, it's much more about who is going to be right for me on this journey for the next 3 to 8 years. Because the person that you might want by your side when your life is about enjoyment and fun and doing things might not be the same person who you want by your side when you're running a home, raising a family. It's very practical. It's quite mundane. It's going to require different people and different compatibilities. So I'm very curious to see what happens. I feel like our lives are going to actually consist of very meaningful, important relationships, but there will be multiple relationships at different stages of our life.
And also as well, I think, as just listening to that answer, it is, we live in a world which is very confusing now. I mean, me and you are having this conversation. This is going to be aired. People are going to listen to this. They may be in a vulnerable state and think, and take what we say as gospel and maybe understand that in a certain way, but then you've got one shoulder saying go and enjoy your life, you've got another shoulder saying you're getting on a bit, I've got women that work for me and they're really, really like worried about finding a partner because they want to have a family, but they can't find somebody to settle with. And every time they meet somebody, again, you're disposable, so it's like, if I have one bad date, I'm not going to see her again, I'm going to go see someone else or him, however it works. So it is like, it's a situation where we're in a world where we're trying to find what's right, but then at the same time we're just consuming so much information. If you go on to, like, for example, the Diary of a CEO, one week you're getting a divorce lawyer, next week you're getting a sleeping coach, next week you're getting a nutritionist, then the nutritionist will say some conflicting evidence against that, and you're like, what is actually right? Like, what is the right way for us? But now let's talk about relationship topics then. So I know we've talked about marriage and all these types of things, but the term red flag gets kind of pushed around a lot. So every time there's something wrong, this person's got a red flag or they're wrong with them. But in your world, do red flags exist? And if they do, like, what constitutes as a red flag?
I think in my world, red flags are sort of profoundly negative and destructive behavior that is not negotiable. And that would be sort of really destructive active addiction, mental health issues that are just not getting addressed in any way, obviously abusive behavior. Those are kind of red flags that are more than red flags. Those are like burning flags that we kind of, we can't ignore. Within a relationship, and especially relationships that have been going on for a while, there can be a lot of bad behavior in relationships. We don't often bring our best selves, and because we're vulnerable, we are defensive, we're more prone to fight or flight, so we can have high conflict things happening in relationships. There can be name calling, there can be a lot of bad behavior that goes on in relationships. And so that's where therapy, to the best of our ability, isn't about judgment or condemnation, but it is about taking responsibility for really unhealthy behavior. And we will all have some version of that. So I guess we can be looking at kind of red flags or amber flags in our relationships and in our own behavior that we want to work on and that we should be working on.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a very good statement, because, like, a red flag, for example, would you constitute a red flag as, like, for example, somebody likes computer games or likes to go out on the weekend for a drink? Is that
No.
a red flag?
No, that isn't what I would count as a red flag. It's much more about behavior and attitudes, and that, I think, is something to very much notice.
And
we are very good in our world today to be mistaking preferences for needs. We're very good to be saying, I need this in a partner and I need it to be like that, I need them to be like this. It's like, well, maybe you would prefer if they didn't, play games, every night for sort of 3 hours or whatever, but that's not a need. That's not a human psychological need. The need is to connect, and so maybe you need to connect outside of that or whatever. So I think there's also this rise in a demandingness in ourselves of what we need and what's non-negotiable, whereas we are with fallible human beings, and guess what, we're a fallible human being too. So let's try to accept one another and recognize the difference between a preference and a need, because we have very few needs but quite a lot of preferences.
Yeah. And what about, another term that gets thrown around is, he gave me the ick. Do you hear that a lot?
I don't hear that a lot, actually, but I'm very familiar with it. Obviously, being in England, it's a much loved phrase over here.
Yeah. I don't know why it would be in South Africa, but yeah. It's quite fascinating because, I've done it before. It's like, oh, she's too keen, she's giving me the ick. Do you know what I mean? Like, it happens, but, like, why is that? Why does that happen?
Well, I think we're really mistaking a kind of fleeting moment or quite a harsh judgment of another person in that moment. We're mistaking that to be a permanent state of being. And that's what we often do with kind of feelings. We feel something, we mistake that for a fact, and we also mistake that for something that's kind of permanent. So it's just a different version of us feeling frustrated or annoyed or fed
Mm.
up with our partners or other people in our life. But there is sort of, when we are in a place where we're getting the ick, we are in a one up position, which is we're kind of looking a little bit down on kind of someone else. So there's a little bit of a power play there. We feel we have power. So when we're dating, we do have power because we can say to this person, I'm no longer interested, bye. And that's our power. So we will always see and perceive things that we don't like, and we can be quite judgmental in those
Mm.
moments. And so this whole, once you've got the ick, you'll never un-ick yourself or whatever, it's kind of, I don't agree with that. I think that's just a
Yeah.
judgment in time that we should try to sort of ride out, because there might be many other positive things that we're overlooking.
Mm. And there's also another thing as well, and that is the controversial topic of lust and love, right? Because
Mm.
they're two similar things, right? I mean, you know, I feel like you have to lust somebody to always want. You know, there has to be some element of lust in a relationship. I think. I don't know what you think on that topic, um, but I feel like also there is an element of lust in a lot of relationships these days, and that's what people are actually looking for, but confusing it for love. Do you find
Mm.
that that's quite a common theme as well within like modern day relationships?
Definitely. I mean, I would sort of approach lust with caution. Lust, I think, is a bit of a temporary state. It's something that we can have initially, and then we need to prolong that in our longer relationships. And that probably would fall under the category, I would place that in desire.
Mm.
We can see someone and not even know them, not even know their name, and feel very physically and sexually drawn to them. We're all capable of that. That does not mean that we will develop love for that person. And it does not mean that we will maintain lust for that person, even. It's a little bit fickle
Mm.
lust. So that's my sort of concern. Lust for me would perhaps be in the same category as infatuation, or that beginning phase of a relationship called limerence,
Mm.
where we're just kind of in this honeymoon altered state where we're not really seeing the person for who they really are. You know, we're in the relationship, we're full of hormones, full of sexual attraction, and we're mistaking that for something very powerful and important and long term, when it's actually something very exciting and fun but short term.
Yeah.
It's kind of, love is something that takes a little bit of time. Lust is something that I think happens very quickly and fizzles out as quickly.
What do you think's happening in the body, though? I mean, you must have studied theories upon these topics where, because it's a very confusing emotion, isn't it? When you meet somebody for
Mm,
the first time, I've been there before, you have a date, it goes so well, and then that lust is there for like 6 months, and then you realize you get
mm,
to a point you're like, well, actually, yeah, this is. But then at the beginning of that particular relationship, you've confused it so much to be with, I'm really into that person. Like you're convincing yourself. So biologically,
yeah.
do you know what's actually going on in our body when we're confusing lust for love and the hormones that are going on?
Well, I mean, the hormones that are released when we find someone sexually attractive or we have lust, these are very primitive drives in us. They're not very sophisticated. They're very primitive. We're animals. We see someone we like, we want to have sex with them, and that's as simple as that. But it can be very exciting talking with them and, engaging in that way with someone in a very highly eroticized time. I mean, the hormones that are being released into our body are stronger than cocaine. They are the most fantastic feelings that we will ever have. They're like the bonding hormone times 1,000. So we are mistaking this for a bond, a genuine bond, a love bond, a long-term bond. It's a very, very physical, primitive thing. And that's why I think I often encourage people to not kind of get very committed to someone
Mm.
after 2 years of knowing someone, because those hormones are so high in us for minimum 12 to 18 months. It's only when those hormones begin to reduce, we begin to normalize, we begin to stabilize, we desensitize to this exciting creature and now start seeing them as a little bit of a human that can be annoying or frustrating or isn't who we thought they were, etc. And that is when we've got to kind of transition between, do I now continue with this person and develop and put effort into something that's more based in love? Or have I just spent time in my life with someone that doesn't have the same values as me, completely different person to me, wants completely different things to me, but we just had an incredibly strong sexual connection, and that kind of camouflaged our long-term compatibility.
Wow. I mean, that was a great answer to that question. Um, and do you know what? As you're saying these things, I'm just constantly thinking about new questions, and I suppose the question is, do you think having a healthy sexual relationship actually then leads to a successful relationship as well, or do you think that you can have a successful relationship without a sexual like connection? Because I've got friends, married friends. They're very open about the way they talk. Some will say we're together, but we have sex once a month. Some will say we have it 3 times a week, 2 times a day. Who knows? But
Yeah.
both of them are still together. So, but in your experience and history, do you feel like that sexual side of a relationship is really fundamental to making it successful?
I mean, a successful relationship is what 2 or more people feel and define is successful. So if people, and especially in this world today where people have a very different and much more instinctive and true relationship with sex, sex can be something that is very important to an individual and or to a partnership, or it needn't be. It's quite difficult to find people to agree on that. So that isn't always the kind of state. But if people are together and they are happy and they feel that they're in a successful relationship, whatever is going on in that relationship is okay. And I think that's really important to respect.
Yeah.
As a professional, as someone who works with people, I love working with people on stuff that I think is the best bits of being in relationship with someone, and that is physical touch and affection and playfulness and enjoyment. I mean, life can become extremely challenging and it is quite hard work, and I really think that joy needs to be part of our romantic lives. This is a beautiful place to put effort into maintaining joy, and I think sex and being sexual and sort of the erotic generally is something that can be a great and important space for any partnership, and I would definitely encourage people to put time and effort and energy into that.
Okay, so good answer, great answer. But when it comes to attachment styles, we obviously spoke very briefly about it, about anxious attachment. Is that correct? I got that one correct. What other attachment styles are there then when it comes to a relationship?
Well, there are 3 attachment styles. There's secure attachment, anxious attachment, and avoidant attachment. And within avoidant attachment, there are 2 sort of subgroups, which is dismissive avoidant and fearful avoidant. And the secure attachment is when people are kind of feel secure, feel stable. There's not a lot of highs and lows. There's not a lot of conflict that's kind of negative and destructive. People are able to be close and intimate and trusting of one another relatively easily. The insecure attachments of anxious attachment and avoidant attachment is where some of the more painful stuff takes place, where we're struggling to feel safe in relationships. And so people who are anxious will put a lot of energy into relationship and worry about relationship and overfunction a little bit and do too much as a way of protecting themselves and trying to get the kind of love they crave. And someone with avoidant attachment will try to feel safe by maintaining a degree of distance, feeling a bit more in control, separating a little bit from their partner because a lot of closeness and intimacy feels overwhelming. So you've got lots of different ways of trying to feel safe and trying to sort of maintain a sense of control in a relationship, which can generally feel quite stressful for anyone with an insecure attachment.
Yeah, and because you hear about some, I mean, I suppose if you've ever got any friends that have been in the terrible relationships, or always seem to be in the terrible relationships, you always hear about that partner that always seems to want to kick off, or every time something feels very settled, they find a way to create an argument. So would you say somebody like that is falls into that attachment style, because it's like at one point there's too much peace, and because they're just used to chaos, they just want there to be a little bit more chaos, but secretly what they're actually desiring is excitement?
Yeah, I would sort of, on that limited amount of information, I would sort of be curious about if there was some fearful avoidant attachment there, which is used to be known as disorganized attachment. And that is definitely people who are and relate in a way that's a little bit more of like an emotional roller coaster.
Yeah.
So there's a familiarity with arguing, dysfunction, chaos, and as you say, excitement. So we can have incredibly addictive relationships, dramatic relationships, dysfunctional relationships, but they can feel exciting and thrilling. And there's, things that aren't really, really dull. And so when there is stability, there's often an unconscious process at play whereby they want to bring some excitement or make tests and make sure that you are in love with them, or kind of just push your boundaries a little bit or whatever. And that's someone who's probably a little bit more disorganized, or what I call fearful avoidant attachment.
Nice. So I've fired off loads of questions about relationships, marriage, you name it. I really want to now dive deep into, you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, you always loved writing. That led you on to write a book. Congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you.
But tell us a bit about the attachment solution, how it came around, and how long it took to write, and just a general overview about the book itself.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, yeah, the attachment solution was born because I'm very interested in solutions. I always little catchphrase of like, let's stay in the solution, not the problem. And so there's a lot of information out there about attachment styles and our various attachments, and it's very kind of about the problem, and this is a problem and this is what we do and this is what's wrong. And there was a real desire to write something about the solution. But I was very, very fortunate. I wasn't planning on writing a book. I was doing stuff online. I was doing my Instagram. I was doing my courses. And I was approached by a publisher to write a book. They said, we really want a book about attachment. We want you to write it. Are you interested? And I was like, yes, I am. I am very interested. Thank you very much. So it really challenged me to fulfill a dream that I had long since given up on. And I found the process unbelievably challenging. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, is to be working the way I work and doing what I do, and then also dealing with a lot of stuff that was happening in my personal life at the time, but to then also write a book about a subject that I really, really care about. And so I really wanted to get it right. And it's an incredibly complicated thing. Anything psychological or psychotherapeutic is really quite complex, but to write it in a way that we can all understand and that makes sense, I found that so incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And it really stretched me, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, you've got to dive deep into the creative parts of your brain.
Yeah.
And dealing with your own problems, dealing with other people's problems. I suppose actually, do you know what? This is actually a question I can't believe I've not asked. How do you separate yourself from the problems? Because I mean, it must be so overwhelming. I've done therapy before, and I think to myself, how does this guy listen 1 hour at a time every single day? We'll come back to the attachment solution, I promise. But how do you separate?
I have to go in a minute. Okay,
How do you separate how do you separate those emotions when these things are happening to you?
Well, this is actually so important, because this is what I try to teach my clients in relationships. It's kind of, because as a therapist, you absolutely have to learn to emotionally regulate and to detach with love and to let go of outcomes and to respect other people and their journeys. And, as a therapist, I'm very fortunate. I work quite long term with people. So I really develop incredibly strong relationships with people. I care about them and love my clients deeply. But when that session ends, it's not as if I just stop thinking about them or stop caring about them, but there has to be a level of detachment whereby I will wait until the next week to see them, or not worry about them, or kind of not be carrying everything that I've absorbed in that session. So my self-care as an individual, as a professional, is really, really big. I need to de-stress. I need to make sure I manage stress. I need to make sure that I'm in the best possible condition so I can also be there for people, and I'm not arriving at sessions kind of exhausted and overwhelmed myself. So that the whole point that you actually started this with, when you said how important is self-care in relationships, it's absolutely vital. It's vital in all areas of our life that we continue to look after ourselves, and we're not getting too enmeshed with other people or over responsible for people who are perfectly responsible for themselves. That skill, that detachment, that respect, and that looking after ourselves is absolutely vital for a therapist. And I challenge all my clients to do the same, because it's very helpful to maintain that too in our relationships.
Yeah. So back to the attachment solution. How long did it take you to write it then? If you're obviously challenging parts of the brains, and you obviously got life and stuff to deal with, how long did it take to write it, get it going?
That's a great question. I don't actually know how long it took me. I think it took me about 18 months. I wrote a lot of it before I even had signed the contract. And then I realized I hadn't signed the contract. Maybe I should just stop, because it may not happen, because it did kind of, go quiet for a bit, and my whole Instagram account got deleted by Instagram. And so I just thought, okay, they're probably not going to want to, support me now or whatever. So so there were sort of periods, but then I had to start, and then suddenly I had to write that. But yeah, it probably took about 18 months in total, maybe a little bit more, because you write the whole thing, and then you've got to edit the whole thing. They send it off to some brutal editor who comes back, and you've got to have your kind of, pride and joy savaged, and all the bits that you liked removed, and, told, some very hard truths. So in that way, it was a great learning experience, very painful, as learning experiences often are. And so it was edited once, and it was edited again. And so I developed a lot of skill to be a good editor, which is, I think, a very big part about being a good writer. But in the end, I feel relatively happy with how I expressed and what I said in the book. I was very scared at one point when I thought, I'm going to write a book and I myself won't like it. But I do like it, and I can go back to it, and I can feel like I've done the subject justice. I feel like it's okay, and I believe a lot of people have found it helpful, so that's very cool.
Awesome. If somebody's listening to this and they're having struggles in their marriage, their relationship with their partner, what's the one piece of advice you would offer to help them try to fix the situation that they're in?
I would say don't lose hope. Relationships by their very nature are extremely challenging, and it's natural to have difficulty in relationships. But if you are struggling, the chances are that you are probably a bit closed to your partner. And that is something that is part of the problem, not part of the solution. It's very, very difficult when I meet people who come in for therapy and two people are completely closed to one another. They've lost respect, they've lost trust, the communication has become very dysfunctional, very destructive, very disrespectful. So I would really encourage to go back to basics. Have manners, be respectful, don't let your communication be rude or disrespectful or unkind. It's kind of level the playing field to something whereby it's constructive. That is the foundation that we all need to set. And that means being open. It's letting go of being so defensive and needing to protect yourself in ways that allow you to still be civil and kind and respectful to the other person. And that will shift the dynamic. And then from there, things can really begin to grow. But go to therapy and get some help.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for all your wisdom and your time and talking with me today to help my audience understand themselves better and their relationships. So thank you very much. I will, of course, include Charisse's social media handles and a link to the book. So if you've loved this episode just as much as I have, go check it out. And obviously, without the kind of you guys showing your love, to the episode and the podcast channel and stuff like that, I wouldn't be able to get amazing guests like this. So if you've enjoyed this episode, one small thing, just hit the subscribe, smash the like button, and drop us a comment. Let me know what your thoughts were on this episode. We'd love to answer any questions that you guys have, and we'll try and get back the answers that you need. And if we need Charisse's help, then I will ask her. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week, guys.